Hi, I'm Ellie Smith, and I'm a member of the Preservative Party, a group of young volunteers who work with Leeds museums and galleries, and my talk is about the skeletons of children excavated from the former Ebenezer Chapel graveyard and what these bodies can tell us about life in Leeds during the Victorian period. These images show the Victoria Gate shopping centre in the Eastgate area of Leeds city centre. Victoria Gate is a luxury shopping complex which opened in 2016. Building of the £165 million shopping centre first began in 2014 when the site, which was then a car park, was excavated. The dig uncovered a medieval ditch filled with buttons, pottery and glass that predated mapping of the area. However, the most unusual find was the remains of a former Methodist chapel yard and in it 21 skeletons, 13 of which were children. Through forensic examination, these bodies paint a picture of life in 19th century industrial Leeds. Leeds, as we recognise it today, is the largest city in West Yorkshire in both area and population. Leeds is the largest legal and financial centre outside of London. It has 4 universities and is popular with tourists for its shopping, food, arts and cultural facilities. However, Leeds began as a small market town, which grew into a centre for the production and trading of woolen cloth. In 1770, Leeds was responsible for 30% of the country's woolen exports. During the Industrial Revolution, it was transformed into a major mill town which was known as the city that made everything. Although wool remained the dominant industry into the 1800s, Leeds also became known for cotton and flax processing, linen production, engineering, iron foundries, pottery, brick manufacturing, and printing. This rapid industrial growth led to a demand for mass cheap labour, prompting large population growth as workers migrated from rural areas and abroad. To accommodate these workers, cheap back-to-back terrace housing was built. This densely populated and unsanitary housing led to the development of slums. The first back-to-back houses were built around 1790 on Briggate, with the purpose of cutting road and drainage costs. Initially, they were built with the outer houses opening onto the streets and the inner houses facing into a shared courtyard. In 19th century Leeds, 70% of all houses built were back-to-backs. The average back-to-back had 2 rooms and a cellar and shared an outdoor privy with between 2 and 8 other houses. The ground floor would act as a kitchen, living room and often workshop for families that did piecework at home. The rest of the rooms would be bedrooms. They had no damp proofing and the only source of water was a pump in the communal yard. It was not uncommon for families to rent just 1 room in a house as this was cheaper. The poorest families would live in the cellars of these small, unsanitary houses. The worst recorded case of overcrowding in back-to-backs documents over 700 people living in just 34 houses. Families that could afford might pay a small monthly fee to join friendly societies, which would provide members with sick pay and free medical treatment if they became ill. Those who were not members of such societies would not be paid if they had to miss work because of illness and would often be sacked. On top of this, as there was no NHS, they had to pay for all medical treatments received. In this period, an illness in a household could force a family onto the street or into the workhouse. Workhouses were run by the local parishes and were meant as a last resort for the destitute and offered basic food, clothing, and a bed, often straw laid on the stone floor of large dormitories. In exchange, inmates of the workhouse were expected to work 10-hour days, 6 days a week, doing tasks such as breaking rocks or picking oakum, although many were too old or unwell to undertake this work. Men, women, and children were kept separate, and families that entered the workhouse might only be allowed to see each other for an hour on Sunday after church. At the time, it was believed that poverty was a moral failing, and the poor workhouse conditions were designed to discourage people from entering. Punishments in the workhouse could be handed out for offences from swearing to violence. Common punishments include beatings, the restricting of food for up to 48 hours, and solitary confinement. There were many workhouses in Leeds. The first parish-run poorhouse in Leeds was the Lady Lane Workhouse, which was established in 1638. Built on the corner of Vicar Lane and Lady Lane, the workhouse was demolished in the 1930s, and the site is now home to the old Red Bus Station, bar and cantina. In 1755, the workhouse accommodated about 150 inmates, which accounted for only a fifth of people who had applied for poor relief from the parish, and by 1800 it had space for 200 people. By the 1840s, the demand on the workhouse had grown considerably, in part due to the influx of Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine, and the Lady Lane Workhouse was unable to cope. As a result, another workhouse was built. The Leeds Union Workhouse, now the Thackeray Medical Museum, was first opened in 1861, costing £32,000 to build. The Union Workhouse offered accommodation for up to 800 people. The Lady Lane Workhouse was approximately a 3-minute walk from Ebenezer Chapel, and for many of the nearby residents, entering this domineering building would have been a very real fear. The site of the skeletal discovery was the former Ebenezer Chapel and Chapel Yard. The Methodist Chapel was opened in 1797. By June 1848, the adjoining graveyard was ordered to be closed for burials by Leeds Town Council, as it had filled to such an extent that it caused public hygiene concerns. The chapel yard was sold in 1874, and in 1881 it is documented as having been cleared of all remains. This is obviously not the case, and it is unknown why these bodies were missed, but as they were all located in one section of the cemetery, it is possible that they were unmarked mass graves. The remains exhumed from the site in 1881 were reburied in Becket Street Cemetery. The church continued to operate until 1896, when it was then used as a warehouse before being demolished and the site turned into a car park. The chapel yard was described as small and very full, surrounded by a dense population. Ebenezer Chapel and churchyard sat right in the centre of Leeds, surrounded by back-to-back housing and factories separated by narrow streets. Some of the alleys leading to these houses were so small you couldn't fit a coffin through. The businesses surrounding the chapel included public houses, pawnbrokers, second-hand clothing stores, lodging houses, and eating houses. During a brief visit to Leeds in 1866, Charles Dickens described the city as a beastly place, one of the nastiest places I know. I have been in one of these damp cellars, without the slightest drainage, every drop of wet and every morsel of dirt and filth having to be carried up into the street, 2 corded frames for beds, overlaid with sacks for 5 persons, scarcely anything in the room else to sit on but a stool, or a few bricks. The floor in many places absolutely wet, a pig in the corner also, and in a street where the filth of all kinds has accumulated for years. This quote was written by Dr. Robert Baker as part of a report in which he aimed to highlight the need for a proper drainage system in Leeds following the cholera outbreak of 1832, which killed 700 people. The streets he described will have been home to the children that we will be examining. Once the skeletal remains had been discovered, they were exhumed by the West Yorkshire Archaeological Service and examined and analysed by Professor Rebecca Gowland and her team at Durham University and York Osteoarchaeology Limited. We will look at their research into 3 of these bodies. They are a young boy, a young girl, and a teenage girl. The first is a girl aged 8 to 10, although initial estimates based on her size put her age between 3 and 5. Examinations of the teeth gave a more accurate window of between 8 and 10. This photo compares her tibia to a tibia from an average child of this period of the same age. Her skeleton shows clear signs of a vitamin D deficiency, also known as rickets. She has pronounced bowing of the legs, flared ribs, and knocked knees. The most common cause of rickets is a lack of sunlight. Ebenezer Street and the local area was comprised of very dense housing and was surrounded by mills. These narrow streets would have been dingy, and the smog from the nearby factories would have exacerbated this. It was not uncommon for poorer children to work in factories, and children from the age of 6 would be employed to work 12 to 14-hour shifts, 6 days a week. This also could have attributed to the lack of natural light that this little girl experienced. A less common symptom of rickets displayed on her bones was the flared ends of the rib bones, which would have been visible as bumps through the skin. This was referred to as rickety rosary, as they resembled a bead necklace. The porosity of her bones is indicative of a vitamin D deficiency, known also as scurvy. This photograph shows an example of a skull that shows signs of scurvy, though this is not our subject's skull, as I was unable to obtain a photograph. Scurvy is associated with malnutrition, and it takes at least a month of very little or no vitamin C in the diet before symptoms begin to occur. Symptoms of scurvy include fatigue, severe joint pain, swollen bleeding gums, and bruised or patchy skin. Although vitamin C is most prevalent in citrus fruits, which were expensive and not available to the lower classes in this era, many other fruits and vegetables that would have been available at a more reasonable price contained vitamin C, such as kale, cabbage, chard, spinach, cauliflower, tomatoes, broccoli, sprouts, and potatoes. This would indicate that this child did not eat vegetables regularly. Severe anemia caused the marrow cavity of her skull to expand, making it appear abnormally thick. Anemia is caused by a body's inability to absorb enough iron. This can be due to a medical condition, or more likely in this case, a poor diet lacking in foods such as meat, fruit, and leafy green vegetables. Similar deficiencies were found in most of the remains at this site. 3/4 of the children found showed skeletal signs of metabolic disease. The combination of these deficiencies would indicate that this child was severely malnourished. The working class diet of this period consisted mostly of bread and basic vegetables such as turnips, carrots, and cabbage. Vegetables would have been grown in rural areas and transported long distances to cities, so by the time they reached the consumer, they were often no longer fresh and therefore not as nutritious. In Victorian cities, most poor households did not have ovens all the time to bake their own bread, and so relied upon their bakers. White flour was expensive, and as there were no regulations, many bakers would adulterate their flour with ingredients such as chalk, iron sulfate, plaster of Paris, and alum, which is a sulfate of aluminium, as this made bread cheaper to produce. Alum made bread appear whiter and heavier, and thus seemingly better quality. However, as well as causing sickness, it prevented the body from properly absorbing nutrients, making malnutrition worse. Now we move on to our teenage girl. The insides of her rib cage, where the bones would have been in contact with the lungs, are woven, which is a response to severe inflammation. This suggests a chronic lung condition, such as pneumonia or TB, which could have been her cause of death. Tuberculosis, often shortened to TB, and also known as consumption, was one of the 19th century's biggest killers. By the end of the 18th century, 1 in every 4 deaths in England was attributed to the disease. It was highly contagious and could be transmitted through coughs, sneezes, and speaking, so it spread very quickly, particularly in densely populated areas like Leeds. TB was a slow killer and often caused patients to cough up blood. Many medicines at the time claimed to cure tuberculosis, but there is no evidence any of them were effective. Some even contained chemicals we now know are poisonous. Similarly to the young girl we examined before, this teen suffered with a vitamin D deficiency. This caused bowing to her left arm. This specific non-symmetrical deformity reveals that this young girl must have applied prolonged pressure to this area regularly. The most likely cause of this would be that she worked long hours, putting her weight on her left arm to leave her dominant right arm free. Several of her teeth contain grooves. These shallow grooves are consistent with her frequently passing something the consistency of wool or flax through her teeth. The picture in the top left is the subject's tooth. The nasal bones show signs of sinusitis and inflammation of the upper respiratory tract. This was particularly common amongst people working in the cotton and wool trades, as small fibers were breathed in and irritated the lungs. This was known as cotton lung. The combination of these findings would suggest that our teen likely worked in a textiles mill. Ebenezer Chapel was surrounded by such mills. The youngest and smallest children in the textile factories were usually employed as scavengers. Scavengers had to pick up any loose cotton. They had to take a brush and sweep under the wheels of the machinery as it was operating. This particular mill role could account for the bowing of the forearm, as the scavenger would put their weight on one arm, leaving their dominant hand to sweep the fibers. Industrial accidents in mills were common, particularly for scavengers, as they could easily be trapped, crushed, and even scalped by the machines if they didn't come out from under them in time. The last body we will look at is a small boy. He has multiple fractures and a broken jaw. The amount of bone healing shows that these injuries were inflicted on different occasions and are consistent with injuries caused by being beaten. It was not uncommon for parents to physically discipline their children during this period, but it is equally likely that these beatings were incurred at work. Mills routinely used corporal punishment to keep children focused. Overseers were responsible for the productivity of the factory floor they ran, so their task was to keep the staff focused on their work and maintaining standards, particularly towards the end of the long shifts when concentration would wane. Children would be beaten with straps to make them work faster and thrashed as a punishment for talking to other children. This slide shows quotes from an interview with a former child textile mill labourer from the Sadler Report. Michael Sadler was an MP and a poor law administrator in Leeds. He compiled the report in an attempt to convince Parliament to reduce the working hours of children to a maximum of 10 hours per day. The report was comprised of testimony of experiences, either personal or as witnesses, of child labour. The Factory Reform Act of 1833 can largely be attributed to the findings of the Sadler Report. By the Factory Reform Act, no child under 9 could be employed by a factory. Employers must have an age certificate for their child workers. Children of 9 to 13 years were to work no more than 9 hours a day. Children of 13 to 18 years were to work no more than 12 hours a day. Children were not to work at night. Children employed in factories were to have 2 hours of schooling a day, and 4 factory inspectors per factory were appointed to enforce these laws. The interview reads, "At what age did you first go to work in a mill?" 8. Will you state the hours of labour at the period when you first went into the factory? From 6 in the morning to 8 at night. 14 hours. Yes. With what interval for refreshment and rest? An hour at noon. What was the consequence if you had been too late? I was most commonly beaten. Severely? Yes, very severely, I thought. State the condition of the children towards the latter part of the day. Toward the close of the day, when they come to be more fatigued, they cannot keep up with their work very well, and the consequence is that they are beaten to spur them on. What were you beaten with principally? A strap. Anything else? Yes, a stick sometimes, and there is a kind of roller which runs on the top of the machines called a billy, perhaps 2 or 3 yards in length and perhaps an inch and a half more in diameter. Have you yourself been beaten, and have you seen other children struck severely with that roller? I have been struck very severely with it myself, so much as to knock me down, and I have seen other children have their heads broken with it. So that you can hardly be in a mill without hearing constant crying. Never an hour, I believe. And if you had been too late, you were under the apprehension of being cruelly beaten. I generally was beaten when I happened to be too late, and when I got up in the morning, the apprehension of that was so great that I used to run and cry all the way as I went to the mill. Were girls more tenderly treated by the overlookers, or were they worked and beaten in the same manner? There was no difference in their treatment. Many of the bodies found at the Ebenezer Chapel yard showed signs of enamel hyperplasia on their teeth, but this boy was a particularly bad case. Enamel hyperplasia occurs when the body becomes severely malnourished or ill. The body will temporarily stop producing enamel whilst it diverts its resources. Each period with no enamel production creates horizontal ridges on the teeth. The number of ridges on this little boy's teeth show long and frequent periods of starvation and poor health. What is particularly interesting is that this child still has some of his milk teeth, which are similarly deformed. Milk teeth begin development in utero before birth, so this shows that his mother was also unwell and malnourished during her pregnancy. The skeletons of these 3 children, together with the others discovered during the Victoria Gate construction, are still under investigation at Durham University. I recently visited the reburial site for those excavated from the Ebenezer Chapel graveyard in 1881, and with the help of Alan Pugh, the chairman of the Friends of Becket Street Cemetery, was able to locate the memorial where they were reburied. This is a picture of that. I am not currently aware of where our bodies will be reburied once they have been fully examined, but perhaps one day they will be able to be reunited with the others from Ebenezer Chapel. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you to Leeds Museums and Galleries for allowing me to give this talk, and thank you for listening.